Yeah, there aren't many people that can get me out of the house 4 weeks after having a baby, but I'm really, really pleased to be here and to be involved in this panel. So, as Ian said, I'm Charlene Weiss, I'm a presenter for ITV News, but we're not talking TV news today, of course, we are talking print. And I'm really pleased to introduce my panel that we have here. We have Jane Bradley from BuzzFeed, we have Tom Bristow from Arshant, we have Jonathan Calvert from the Sunday Times, it's John, not Jonathan, we'll call you Jonathan today, Paul Henderson from the Daily Mirror, and we have Claire Newell from the Telegraph. As you can see, their pictures up there. So, guys, we're talking about investigative journalism, and is it still relevant in the age of clickbait? Paul, I'm going to start with you because I believe that this is your 50th year of being involved in journalism. So you know exactly what you're talking about, and you've got a wealth.
The Informer is on this.
And you definitely have a wealth of experience to be able to talk about this particular subject. I'm going to start with one of your investigations, which had huge ramifications and still does, and that's the Telford sex abuse scandal. That was 2 years of work that was involved in that. Do you think the public care as much about investigations such as that as they have done historically?
Well, they certainly do care, and they care a lot. We could tell from the reaction we got from readers. It was at the Sunday Mirror, which I was editing last year, and the investigation started about, say, 9 months before that, but I was involved as an executive editor across 7 days. So I heard you talk in the last panel about how you pull resources, and we started that investigation on the Sunday Mirror with Geraldine McKelvey, who passionately wanted to be the spokesperson for these vulnerable girls who were not being listened to by the authorities. And we engaged the investigations editor of the Daily Mirror for his skills, because they had a different set of skills, to get this off the ground. And I'm telling you the background before getting to the point.
Yeah.
And along the route, the obstacles that the team in particular had to get over were incredible. The police were trying to prevent some of the girls from speaking to our reporters, telling them that they were being exploited by a newspaper. The girls wanted to get their stories out there, and they were very harrowing stories, and girls being abused from the age of 13 by a gang, sometimes 10 men a night. and then we discovered that one of the perpetrators had burnt down the house of one of the victims and killed 3 members of the family. When I was told this, I was staggered. I thought, surely this hasn't happened, and if it has, why haven't the authorities done anything about it? So anyway, the team ploughed on, and we got to a point where we thought, well, we need we are getting a lot of information, but we need to break a barrier here somehow. We need to find out what the authorities were or were not doing about it. So we asked several of the girls if they would apply for the police files on their cases, which they can do, and they have the right to have access to. Once again, the authorities, including the police and the local authority, tried to suppress this. Eventually, the girls who were put under enormous strain managed to get their files on discs, and then when they got hold of the files and we tried to open them up, they were unreadable because of the damage that had been done to the discs before we got hold of them. Anyway, fast forwarding, we eventually came to a point where we decided to devote the front page and 4 pages inside to exposing this whole story. And it led to an independent public inquiry, which is being set up as we speak, and a police investigation which has led to 5 arrests up to this date. Now, to get back to your point, it's very relevant to readers, particularly to our industry, that we speak truth to power, and especially for vulnerable people who are not being listened to. And yeah, we get strong reactions from the readers to say, well done.
It's interesting, because I was going to ask you about telling the stories of vulnerable people. Yeah. Do you think that enough publications are doing that as much as they were before?
Well, I don't know about comparing it with before, but we've never done enough. Throughout my 50 years, when I started on local newspapers, I was working in the East End of London, and we had a great editor there, and we were encouraged to go out and write on social issues. They didn't call it social issues in those days, but that's what they were, and particularly on housing and the terrible slums that people were living in, and nothing was being done by Rachman-type landlords. And so local, it's always been done, and it's been done throughout my time in newspapers, but I wish we'd always done more, because people depend on us to get their stories out there and to make things happen for them.
Jane, some of the investigations that you've done in the past has touched on the vulnerable. So I remember an investigation to do with the homeless being exploited, for example. Is it something that's important, especially in, I mean, you know, you're from BuzzFeed, so you could say that, you know, you guys are the granddaddy of clickbait when it originally, you know, if we're going to be, of course, that's what we're talking about is clickbait articles. But is it one of the things that's important to you to tell the stories of the vulnerable?
Yeah, that's absolutely one of the cornerstones of what we do. And I think, I don't quite have 50 years of experience to call on, but in the 10 years that I worked in the industry, I've kind of, I think since Brexit, we're seeing more and more of the Daily News kind of reporting on the Brexit process and resources in kind of a already under-resourced industry being focused on kind of one big news event, which means that it's not going to other stories, other untold stories, in particular, you know, stories of the vulnerable. And I think that is really a place for investigative journalism, not necessarily just, there are investigations to do into Brexit, of course, and there's huge public importance there, but I also think the role of investigative journalists, we have the luxury most of the time, in terms of times and resources, to go away and really dig into something that the rest of the press might not have the resources or the time to do that. And I think we kind of owe it to the vulnerable and those stories who aren't being told, to keep focusing on these untold stories, not just follow the rest of the news agenda.
Tom, Jane mentions resources there, and as we touched on in the introduction, when it comes to a local level, a lot of the time the resources are being siphoned off elsewhere. So that makes your job then even more important than before in terms of telling those local stories.
Yeah, it certainly does, but it also gives you a kind of a freer field to play in, because no one else is out there doing it. Like you know, a lot of people we talk to, they say, "Oh, I've tried to go here and go there." We're almost like their last resort to tell their story and try and get some kind of like justice or compensation or whatever it is, because they feel let down by, you know, other services. And yeah, a lot of the stuff we cover, you know, fits into wider narratives on the national level about, say, you know, housing or mental health or, you know, schools, whatever it is. But yeah, we're kind of operating there as their local voice for it. Yeah,
and tell us about the child sex abuse story that you guys did recently.
Yeah, so I've got to be a little bit careful because it was an ongoing police investigation. So this was just a cold call to the newsroom, just came in on the reporter's phone, and the reporter just gave it to me because it sounded complicated, and that's where the stuff tends to go. And this was a guy up in Newcastle who, he was very nervous, wouldn't give his name, wouldn't leave his number, wouldn't give any details about himself, other than I was at this boarding school in Norfolk, so on the patch of the Eastern Daily Press, which is the main title I write for. In the 80s and 90s, loads of kids were abused. Police have just told me the investigation's over, there's nothing they can do about it. Like he was so angry and just felt he had nowhere to go. So I think out of desperation just looked up, you know, the local paper and gave it a call in the hope that someone might listen to him. And yeah, it turned out there was a lot of now adults in his position, sort of in their 40s and 50s. Because he wouldn't leave any details, I just said, look, call me back on Friday once I've had time to look into it. He was just bombarding us with information. And I guess that also shows another advantage on the local level, is that we've got sort of a lot of cut-ins and a huge archive to look back on. So I could tell that the basis of his story, that he had a concern about this school, was genuine from looking in our library, because we covered stories about this school closing down. No mention of abuse or anything like that, but certainly there was hints of controversy within old articles from the 90s. And yeah, he just called me back on a week later and put me in touch with about 8 or 9 other people. We published several stories on that in August, and police have now reopened their investigation with all the new evidence that we've given them. So we've passed them a file of about 10 or 11 witnesses and their statements.
And how have your local readers reacted to a story such as that?
So I don't know about sort of other people on the panel, will perhaps be able to speak better on that, but when it comes to child abuse investigations, like they're really difficult to do, and B, the kind of reaction from readers is, I found to be quite minimal, because it's not something that people particularly want to come forward and talk about. So the impact there has obviously been getting authorities and the police to listen and start their investigation, but I haven't, been flooded by hundreds of emails saying well done, but then you rarely get readers congratulating you, do you?
Claire, let's move on to you. And one of the big investigations you did, of course, was into Sir Philip Green. And it's interesting, Brexit has been mentioned very briefly, but when you've got a news cycle that seems to be obsessed with one massive story, and the news cycle is relentless at the moment, how do you get your readers to still be interested in those other big stories, such as Sir Philip Green?
I think you try to pick topics that kind of have resonance and feel very now, but also generally, I think when things are in the public interest, readers will be interested. So when we were researching that story, the kind of Me Too scandal, it felt very, very current. And it felt like just the kind of things that investigative journalists at the Telegraph or anywhere else should be doing. You almost get that sense, I think, as a reporter. It kind of resonates as a story, and you think, yes, this is something we can pile into for 6 months or a year, which is a rather massive undertaking. And then the paper have got to back you with doing that. And luckily, the Telegraph do, and we've got a team of full-time investigative journalists who can work flat out on one particular story. And certainly when it comes to people like Sir Philip, you've got to be prepared for a bit of a fight.
And what was that fight like for you as a team?
I think it was relentless, actually, if I'm honest, because there was the kind of investigation, which probably took about 6 months, and after maybe 2 months, Sir Philip knew that we were asking questions, and of course tried to stop us from doing so. So it puts a lot of pressure on the paper and a lot of pressure on reporters, and tries to tell you, you're an idiot, you've got it all wrong, blah, blah, blah. And that's when it's important to be confident in your sources and to trust your instinct. And then, of course, later, when you decide to put the allegations to someone and then you have a legal battle, at that point, again, it's utterly crucial for you as a reporter and the paper to think, okay, well, if we're going to take this on, we're in for the long haul, which is an absolutely massive financial commitment, but also a time commitment. So with this investigation, there was a temporary injunction, and then there was a hearing, and we managed to overturn that. The judge said it was in the public interest for us to be able to publish. So Philip very quickly went up to the Court of Appeal, or his lawyers did. We waited for their decision, and they said, oh no, there should be an expedited trial. And I just couldn't believe that this was going on, really, because to me it was so clearly in the public interest, and we were facing all these barriers. And I was, of course, terrified that we might give up, that we might think it was too expensive. But we kept on going, and we were preparing for trial. So now my job changed. I almost turned into a kind of semi-lawyer, trying to put things together and get all the documents ready. And of course, speaking to sources to make sure our case was as strong as possible. And it's almost a kind of game of blink in those situations, because you can't be seen to be wanting to, or thinking you might back down. And of course, from my point of view, there's no way I was backing down. But you don't know necessarily if that's the case. And then a couple of weeks before trial, Sir Philip decided he was going to drop the injunction, which meant we were free to publish. But of course, through this whole process, he was threatening to bankrupt the paper to make sure I didn't work again. I was that girl, you know, who knows whatever he said about the editor. And we were getting a lot of flack. But, you know, that's why you do this job, isn't it? To make sure that you're holding people like him to account.
Exactly. And if we're talking about big beasts being held to account, Jonathan, the FIFA files is a very good example of that. Did the paper back you right from the very start when you started looking into it?
Yes, it was a long investigation, actually. It's funny, because I was just thinking, because Claire and I started it back in, whenever it was, 2010, I think it was, wasn't it? We did a story called World Cup Votes for Sale, in which we were undercover and we exposed the incredible kind of venality within FIFA at that point. And out of it, it led to our work with the FIFA files, which I did with Jane's colleague, Heidi. And it's kind of, it was over, I think it spanned between about 2010 and 2015. After our initial story that we did together, we'd had a tip-off originally about the fact that there was corruption within the bids for the World Cup, and we decided to go undercover, which we do occasionally, and we do under special circumstances. I always have to get this right because we've got our lawyer here. We do this when it's in the public interest, when the information couldn't be got from any other means, and when we have a kind of reasonable belief that we have some information that suggests that this might be true. And we went undercover with all these ex-FIFA executives, people who'd voted in the competitions before. At the time, England was bidding to host the World Cup. And it was astonishing, absolutely astonishing. I don't know if you remember, we went to about 6 people, and each one of those FIFA executives said to us the same thing, that if you're going to win the World Cup, you've got to pay bribes. And it was as simple as that. And they kind of go through the list of people. And we did the story, and 2 of the voters were suspended as a result of it. And out of it, but while we were there, one of the kind of emerging issues was that completely bizarrely, the tiny nation of Qatar was going to win the 2022 competition. And we did some stories on that initially, didn't we? And then later, somebody came to us, and it was a very different type of journalism. This was more a more modern data drop kind of journalism. Someone pointed us to someone who had this incredible database full of information about one particular man, actually, in particular, a man called Mohammed bin Haman, who was very much the architect of the Qatar bid for the 2022 World Cup. And we published that in 2014. That was quite a slog. I mean, it was kind of, I remember Heidi and I went to this secret place up in the north somewhere. And we were there from, I think, March through to June, just before the World Cup in Brazil was about to start. And it was just a lot of information to get through, and we had kind of modern systems to search it, but it was a huge job. And in terms of, do they back you on it? I mean, the Sunday Times really backed us on that story. We did the first 11 pages of paper on one story, which I think, as our then news editor Charles Hymas said, it was kind of unheard of, apart from in times of war, actually. And that kind of coverage kind of creates great impact. It went all around the world, and it was the beginning of the end, really, for FIFA, and it kind of the regime of Sepp Blatter, which had been so corrupt, really. I mean, it kind of, in order to cling on to power, he had allowed all this to go on underneath him, so in effect we did get a result, but I don't think we've cleaned up world football. I think there's still quite a long way to go. Sorry?
It's a good start in terms of trying to clean up world football. Paul, when you're choosing the stories that you're working on, has that changed at all over the years because of technology? So, do you think about, okay, will people click on that story if they see it on Facebook or on Twitter, or is your head very much solely on getting it into the paper, the physical paper?
I don't think the judgment has changed. You know, a good story is a good story, and any trained journalist will know, you know, what that is. Some excite you more than others, and you put more resource into it. You know, now if a good story comes into the office, and you look at it, and it's something that needs investigating, for instance, you're going to look at particular skills within the office to get that off the ground, and maybe get 2 or 3 people working on it. But the judgment call, to go back to your point, I don't think it's really changed. And talking about, it's interesting that you mentioned, you know, what do I have in my head in terms of the digital aspect? Yeah. So we are integrated, and yes, we do think more about that. And for instance, the print journalists now are very aware that when they go out on a story, they are thinking about what they can do for online, because like at the Mirror, there's up to 14 million page views a day. So that is an incredible platform to get your story onto. It's powerful. And for instance, I'll say to them as I leave the office, don't forget we're going to need some video of this interview. Generally speaking, they don't need telling or reminding, but just in case they revert to old school print and they haven't got it. So, yeah, but we understand the power of getting a package together for digital as well as print.
Claire, do you think the investment is the same from papers into an investigations unit?
Yes, I think so, actually. So when I joined The Telegraph, I was working with a woman called Holly Watt, and she and I were doing the investigations. And then actually, I've been there for 8 years now, the team has expanded. So now there are 4 of us. So I think that's a good example of a newspaper wanting to back investigative journalism and realising that exclusive journalism is very, very important. And I would always say it's brand affirming and potentially brand enhancing. So if you get big stories like the Philip Green Me Too scandal or the corruption in English football scandal that we did a couple of years ago, it really is great for you, because it means that the Telegraph is always on the news. People have heard of those stories. You know, you get into a taxi and someone says, oh, you work for the Telegraph. Oh, you must have done that story about blah, blah. And that means people are talking about your work. And at a time where things are so competitive, and we've got to all be thinking, how are we going to draw in subscribers, or at least viewers or clicks or whatever? It's that kind of exclusive stuff that I would say is the key to it all, because we can all do fast turnaround news.
But, I mean, when it comes to how much interest the public has, if we look to America as an example, with all the exclusives that have been done in terms of President Trump, for example, in terms of the news cycle, it'll be big news for a few days and then everyone just kind of forgets about it and the public doesn't appear to have an interest. Jonathan, do you think we're in danger of reaching that level over here when it comes to the way that our readers consume what it is that we do?
Well, I mean, you can't tell how a story will be followed up. It's always quite difficult to work that out. But and certainly our news cycle is very, very fast. And so actually what we find is that certain stories that go big can burn very, very quickly. They can be over, and they can be a lot of coverage in a couple of days, and then they go. Other stories kind of stay around, and it kind of depends on the information in there. We did a story about Boris Johnson and his American friend Jennifer Arcuri recently, and that was kind of on the front pages of paper for about three weeks. So we just kind of. People were kind of finding more and more and more and more about it. It all depends on whether this is a story that's got legs or not, to a certain extent. And I think, I always think the disturbing thing about the American example is that you can put facts out into the public domain, and they're now doubted. I mean, and that is very disturbing. I do think it's a really good reason why investigative journalism is important, because it's about building stories that are very, very solid, that's very difficult to refute. But no, I mean, again, it really depends on the story as to whether it's less or not.
Public scepticism was what I was going to get to next, actually. So, Jonathan, thanks very much for bringing that up. And I was going to talk to you, Jane, when it comes to online publications. And do you feel like you have to fight even more for your story in terms of the public to believe what it is that you're talking about because of the public scepticism when it comes to facts and figures, and you can show someone a document saying, no, it is true, and they'll still go, no, I don't necessarily believe you. Do you feel like you have to not fight just your editor to get your story in, but fight the public in terms of convincing them that what you're writing is actually true?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, these days the go-to insult for anyone who doesn't like the story you're publishing is it's fake news, whether it's politicians or normal members of the public. And I don't think it's just internet or digital publications. I think the media overall is in a crisis of trust. And like Jonathan said, I think that means that shows why investigative journalism, good, thorough, in-depth reporting is more important than it's ever been. For us, being a new digital publication, there's definitely extra work we have to do to basically show that we're good journalists and we do good journalism. And we're not automatically going to have the gravitas of, say, the BBC where I used to work, or the Times even, or somewhere like that. We've really got to fight for someone to believe in what we've published. So one of kind of the founding principles of something like BuzzFeed Investigations, or even news has always kind of done since we really invested in serious journalism, is we always try to basically show our workings. We're very transparent. So in our stories, certainly in all the investigations I do, we kind of unpack kind of what our evidence is, and not only that, we publish what we can. Obviously, the sensitive documents, we can't do that, but say it's FOI responses, we will publish that FOI. If it's leaked documents, we will publish a redacted version of that document. And it really works, because some people will be like, what is BuzzFeed? You can't trust them. They'll be like, no, but have you seen this document from the Department of State or whatever, like that? So I think that goes a long way. And I don't think it's just BuzzFeed that can be doing that, to be honest. I think more newsrooms are starting to do that, because we need to gain this trust.
Tom, is trust an issue on a local level as much as it is on a national level?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the public and readers are very, quick now to try to undermine stories that they don't like. There's far more public awareness, isn't there, of, how to kind of challenge the journalism that you're producing. Then you've got other issues such as, some people are very quick to accuse you of, say, breaching their privacy or harassment or whatever it is when you've literally sent them one email. And so you've got that challenge as well. But yeah, it's a difficult place to publish into, and you never quite know how your story is going to be received, or have you made one like tiny, this is what keeps me up at night before you publish something, I made one tiny genuine error, which will then be used to kind of undermine the whole story. Yeah. And then, say the council, police, or whoever doesn't like the story are then going to jump on that and try to, rubbish the whole thing.
Has technology then changed in terms of the stories you choose to do and how you write them, and the interaction you have with local police, local councils, for example? Because they can immediately put their right to reply in a tweet, which they couldn't do years previously. Yeah,
it always amuses me when, say, like, a local council will release a press release undermining your story. Like, who's going to pick up on this press release about your story? Do you know what I mean? But there's... Yeah, I mean, generally, technology has been a massive help, hasn't it? Like, as Jane says, it means that you can publish your evidence, you can put PDFs up of your, the documents that support your story. We use it a lot for like data scraping and things like that. We can do data stories now, which we never would have been able to go near, because we just wouldn't have the resource to sift through this, and it would just be mind-boggling. But now we've got, these very powerful programs which can do all that, that work for us.
And Jonathan, if you're working undercover, does technology make that harder? Because when people are trying to track down your image, for example, which is, we're not taking photographs today, so you can see up on the screen because some of these guys work undercover. Does it make it harder? Does it make you want to, the way you work change as a result?
Well, a lot, because actually what's changed it hugely is mainly social media. Because nowadays, years ago, I did Cash for Questions, and I turned up in the House of Commons and just paid people £1,000 to ask a question. And I didn't have to have any kind of background. I just kind of made up a story, used my own address, and just used a slightly different name. Nowadays, nobody exists unless they have a strong social media presence. And so therefore if you're pretending to be someone else that you're not, you kind of have to then set up a whole list of things such as websites, Twitter pages, all sorts of things that you wouldn't have. And making them look real is really quite difficult. I mean, it's made undercover journalism much, much more difficult, I think. I mean, I don't know what you think, Claire, but it's.
Yes. It is very hard because people will be trying to check you out in a way that they maybe wouldn't have before. And you're right, if you don't have a Facebook account or a LinkedIn account or something, and it's not all singing or dancing, which is quite a lot of work, then you might look a bit odd. And so you've always got to have an excuse ready why you haven't got that.
Yeah, I mean, I now have relented, and my image is on the internet, which is partly because when I was working with Jane's colleague Heidi several years ago, we were buying a baby in Bulgaria, and we came across two people who were offering us a baby, but they were kind of slightly odd. We were in a hotel room with them. We were filming them, and we thought there's something really weird about the questions they were asking. So we tried to follow them afterwards, and we couldn't. But the man had been wearing some strange glasses, and we looked them up we've just literally put spy glasses into the internet, and there on Amazon were his glasses. So they had been filming us, and we had been filming them, and we thought, well, we rang them up and said, oh, look, we're journalists, this should be okay, we're obviously working on the same thing. Let's coordinate. But they had other plans, and they ran this video, which kind of the story was just, we were investigating the baby's trade, and this funny thing happened, and the thing went viral because, as you can imagine, journalists filming journalists. It was quite. So my photo was out there, and at that point, I thought, actually, I may as well just allow it to be out there.
And if you have to sort of jump through all these hoops when you're doing undercover work, does that also mean you have to think more carefully about what stories you choose to do and whether it's worth it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a time when there was quite a lot of undercover kind of Westminster stories, and I think that's almost impossible now. I mean, I think MPs are extremely wary of that type of story. It doesn't mean that stories aren't still valid and they shouldn't be done, but the traditional ways of doing it, I think, probably don't work any longer.
But Paul, when it comes, if we are talking about undercover and doing the politics stories, the political stories, surely that's more important than ever. Obviously, the way that we used to do it has changed, and politicians are a lot more aware of their public conduct now than they used to be. But does that mean our jobs are even more important now than they used to be?
They're even more important, but they're even more difficult, as you were just explaining that. And it made me think of something I did in '93 on the Northern Ireland, Secretary Michael Mate. And he got very close to Azil Nadir, who was a Tory donor. And some long-standing contacts said to me that, we should be looking into this relationship because Nadir was up on charges of £30 million fraud with Polypec. And in those days, no one's going to go on social media and look up your profile and find out who you are. And I had to go out and see a lot of people and be posing as somebody else. And eventually, we got hold of some documents. And as you were speaking there, Jonathan, I was thinking, if I got hold of these documents now, what would the data protection angle be? And those documents were crucial. And we ran, I was at the Daily Mail then, even though we were attacking the Tory minister, and we splashed the story. And the story was that I'd got hold of a letter that he had written to the Attorney General complaining about the handling of Nadir's case. And within 24 hours, Mate, I think it was as quick as that anyway, he resigned. And my job then was a lot easier, I believe, than it would be now because of all the regulations that we have to get through, which are not only within our industry, but are even, you know, data protection, as I've mentioned. Yeah, so it is more difficult, but it's very important that we keep doing it.
Yeah.
We have to find other methods, other ways of doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jane, when it comes to a younger, because obviously the BuzzFeed, I would say, skew towards a younger reader, a younger demographic.
Yeah, we reach about 70% of millennials, so most of our audience are young people.
And are they as passionate about investigations, about getting to the truth, from a reader perspective, but also from a young journalist perspective as well, those that are coming through the ranks? Are they as thirsty for the truth and as thirsty to get undercover and do undercover work and to do the investigations?
Yeah, I mean, well, from a kind of a young audience point of view, first of all, our readers certainly, and I think young people in general, are absolutely interested in investigations. I think you've got a younger generation which is more angry and pissed off by the authorities than ever, and that's our job as investigative journalists, to hold power to account. So all of our investigations, they're kind of long reads, kind of minimum from 3,000 words, up to our Russian assassinations investigation was 15,000 words, which is kind of nuts. But people read them. We had the last investigation I did, a Me Too investigation into the self-help guru Tony Robbins, had nearly 6 million views. And most of those are young people. Same for Russia, had millions as well. And these are young people who are interested in these investigations and, you know, whatever kind of the myth may be about young people's attention span or interest in these things, they read till the end. So obviously they're not going to read a 3,000-word article about bin collections or something, but neither would somebody older. So I think if you're doing the right investigations that tap into something that they're angry about or that affects them, same as you would for a newspaper or a broadcaster, then people are going to read them. And from kind of a young reporter's point of view, I'm flattered you still call me a young reporter, but I'll take that. At BuzzFeed, I'm old. Anyone over 30 is old. But yeah, I mean, I think people are still, there's less undercover investigations, especially for an American organisation, because for some reason the Americans hate undercover and they're really obsessed with privacy, and we've tried to push undercovers on them, but they're just not having it. But they are really interested in learning investigative journalism, the skills, and a lot of the skills, like what I use at BuzzFeed, are the same I use at Panorama. Yeah. They're really old-fashioned skills. We're like the oldies of the newsroom. I use Trace IQ before GDPR, but documents companies' house, we're door-knocking people. How we do investigative journalism isn't any different, I don't think, or the types of stories we do than a newspaper or broadcaster. What is different is how we package them, how we tell the stories. So when I was at the BBC, kind of social media would kind of be a last-minute thought. It'd be like, oh, have you got something for the website? Or have you got something for Twitter? Whereas somewhere that's kind of digitally native, like BuzzFeed, all the young journalists are kind of taught to think of that from the start, you know, from the commissioning of the stories. Like, okay, what could work for video? What could work for Facebook, Instagram? So how we tell them basically is different. And I think those are skills that young journalists are expected to have, and you've got to be increasingly multi-skilled. Like now we're expected to code, data scrape, film, as well as be able to write news articles, long reads. So I think that's the only difference, but the passion is still there.
I've got a couple of minutes before I'm going to throw questions out into the audience. So if you do have questions, not quite yet, a couple of minutes, but I'm just giving you a 2-minute warning that will do sort of 20 minutes of questions, but I've just got a couple more questions to ask the panel, and then I'll throw it over to you guys. Tom, continuing with that theme of young people and young journalists, do you feel that on a local level you haven't, you know, your younger journalists have enough time to learn those skills to become a Jonathan or a Paul or a Jane or a Claire, for example?
We're trying, yeah. We're certainly trying to give them the time. Like we have, my editor's in the room, so I'm going to be really nice to him. We're like, there's been sort of loads of training in the last couple of years and focus on giving younger reporters the skills that they're going to need to succeed, because like local papers in particular take journalists at the start of their career. That's always been the case. There's like a ridiculous percentage of our newsroom are trainees. And so it's kind of our job for, you know, more experienced people like me there to guide them and give them training and bring expertise in. So we've had like sessions with the Centre for Investigative Journalism. They've come in and giving everyone training in like open source investigations. We've got a group called Crosscheck, Full Fact coming in. Sorry, not Full Fact. First draft. Thank you, John. Coming in a couple of weeks to give us all skills on social media verification and, you know, how to make sure we're not falling for doctored videos and
Russian
images online, or, you know, particularly in like lead up to the election and propaganda material and things like that. So, yeah, there is a lot of like resources out there which are free to give people the training.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it's, you know, kind of down to that reporter as an individual. What do they want to do? What do they want from their career? All we can do is kind of show them that the stuff's there and how to do it. But like the attitude, I think, is so important at the start, because you've got to want it, haven't you? You've got to be hungry for it, because you're going to put yourself through a lot just to get the story, a lot of stress and yeah.
And I think that was an important point that Tom raised at the start, kind of young people kind of getting the resources, the time to learn these skills. Because one thing, you know, I have noticed working at BuzzFeed, where again, kind of a lot of people will start their careers, so they're really learning from scratch, is they're obviously amazing at social media and digital, but they are not used to even picking up the phone. Like, I'll ask kind of a young fellow or something, can you get in touch with this person? They're like, yeah, I did it. I'm like, how did you? Like, I sent them a DM on Twitter. I'm like, you're gonna have to pick up the phone, or you might have to door knock or find these documents. And it's not necessarily like their fault, I don't think. I think it's more and more under-resourced, and you need someone to... I also started out in regional news at the BBC, and I had a great team of journalists, much more experience, who kind of took the time to teach me how to do all of these things, and you don't always get them these days, but I think editors should still be encouraging those skills, because otherwise you're going to end up with a generation of journalists who are great online but can't do kind of, you know, the basics of investigative journalism in particular.
So the final question to you then, Claire, but sticking with the young journalist theme, on a national level, do you think there is enough investment going into to provide a next generation of investigative journalists?
Yes, I think so. I think most newspapers have trainee schemes, and that's a way of bringing young reporters into newsrooms or into features or magazines or whatever, and broadcasters too, I think. I guess what's always worth acknowledging is you can learn a lot from them. So if a trainee comes in, they're bound to be much better than me on social media. So I can learn from them, and then they can hopefully learn from me about how to do a good door knock, or how to persuade someone on the phone to kind of give you a little bit more than they might want to otherwise. And, you know, realistically, resources are tight for us all, but unless we're investing in new people and new ways of doing things, we're never going to grow. So I think it's a fantastic thing that we have a trainee programme, and you know, it's really a very good trainee programme. I'm sure I would have benefited from doing it as well. And then you're bringing new ideas in all the time.
Which is equally as important.
Yes.
Well, it's enough of me asking questions. We've got the microphones, roving microphones from both sides of the room. So you can raise your hand, and then when the microphone comes to you, if you can do this gentleman just here, fourth row from the front. And if you'd be able to give us your name and where you're from, your question, and if there's a specific person on the panel you'd like to direct your question to, then do say so. And if you could stand, and then we can see you.
Goodness me. My name is Simon Bucks. I'm from BFBS. I just wonder what the panel think about joint investigations with other media organisations, co-productions, if you like. I suppose on one hand, you get more resource. On the other, it's probably not always terribly easy, and I'm thinking particularly of the sort of Cambridge Analytica story, which was very successful, but the relationship wasn't altogether smooth, and I just wonder what your view is on working with other, particularly with broadcasters.
We did quite a lot of it, actually. We're doing something with Panorama at the moment. We did something with Channel 4 earlier this year. We like it because it's quite good for us, because it kind of gives the story more impact. If you can imagine, you know, we'll do a story on a Sunday and they'll do it on the Monday in pictures. But also it doubles the research effort, and also kind of gets you you learn new methods from working with different people. It's always useful in that way. I mean, the big collaborations we've had some experience of. It's more difficult for us because we're a Sunday newspaper, and we're often out of step with all the deadlines. So, you know, the dailies can always agree a deadline, whereas, you know, hardly unless we had a collaboration of Sunday newspapers, We did one with the European Investigative Collaboration, and it was a bit like the United Nations. I mean, there were so many. I mean, honestly, most of it was diplomacy. It was all kind of haggling all the time about who should do this, who should do that when, and it was quite hard work. It was good in the end. I mean, we got some good stories out of it, but it's quite a difficult thing. And we'd have these, and the meetings would just go on and on and on. I mean, it's a real commitment if you do it.
Yeah.
We kind of had the same when we first launched BuzzFeed's investigations team in 2015. Kind of one of the big things for us was impact and getting people to take us seriously and reaching this wide audience. So I think, the first few investigations we did, we teamed up and collaborated with the BBC in particular because they have a huge reach. And also our audiences don't cross over. Like, we're bringing a young audience to the BBC and they're bringing a much wider kind of a much wider audience to us. So we would kind of do our investigations, then kind of offer it to the BBC to be partners with. We also did a really successful collaboration with the Washington Post on unmasking the ISIS executioners. And that was a really great collaboration because I basically did all the underground stuff of tracking down. It was Alexander Coty and El Shafi El-Sheikh, the two ISIS beetles in the UK, because I knew the patch, I knew how to found them. Whereas in the US, the reporter I worked with, he had all the US intelligence sources who was giving me leads on kind of date of birth, names, that kind of thing. So that was a fair collaboration, and again, different audiences. I think, like Jonathan said, kind of some collaborations are easier than others. If you're working with a journalist you know and you trust each other, it can work really well and there's equal sharing. I think if one partner doesn't trust the other, or you're not sharing information, or there's like 5 different partners and there's endless meetings and bureaucracy, then it can be a pain in the ass to get out. But I think ultimately investigative journalism, we want to make an impact. Like, for us, it's not about clicks or just publishing the story. We want like investigations or some kind of change, and I think you can only get that when the media kind of either collaborates or you're all putting pressure on the same issue.
It's also really hard for another outlet to follow up on someone else's investigation because you don't have the documents and the evidence, and you're obviously publishing potentially very defamatory material. So we've worked with the BBC locally on a story earlier this year about how a local enterprise agency was misusing funds to enrich the companies of its directors. And that was great because, you know, normally it would have just been in our paper on our websites, but we were the top story on the BBC Evening News that night, and that was like a real moment where I thought, yeah, that, you know, it's got to be the way forward, more collaboration between different groups.
That's good. You got another question? The gentleman just here in the blue shirt, and then we'll come to you afterwards.
Paul Connew, media commentator. Hillary Clinton today has made an interesting intervention into the withholding of the report on Russian meddling in British politics. Even though the select committee involved, the intelligence services and the cabinet officer who cleared it, number 10, are blocking it. If a public-spirited spook, politician or civil servant came to you, or even the old-fashioned brown envelope or a well-disguised electronic leak came to you, would you use it even though technically it would be illegal?
Who wants to tackle that one?
Sorry, I know Jonathan had a taste of it on last Sunday. I don't know whether, he wouldn't tell us, I'm sure, whether he's seen a lot more, but that was interesting in itself.
I'll be quite happy to deal with that one. I'll be very pleased if it came in a brown envelope, Paul, to the office, but there'll be a lot of processes after that to ensure, you know, it was genuine, and we'd have to be working out the public interest, you know, in getting it out there. I think we'd work out a way of getting that one onto the front page. Personally, I can't see a problem with it, as long as the provenance is okay. I'm
assuming that one would trust one's source or have be able to
somehow would corroborate the document, wouldn't we? We'd work out that this is really a genuine document, and I can't see problems there, but there are lawyers around. I might have a different view. I can see a real argument ensuing on the editorial floor. But,
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Get it? Just here. There was another gentleman just here. Thank you.
Hello, Phil Harding, journalist and a recovering editor. I wanted to ask a bit more about data journalism and how that's changed your job. The classic way, obviously, of starting an investigation seemed to be, as you described, that you get a tip-off and then you go looking for the evidence. These days, with the data dump and the amount of data there is, it often seems that you've got the evidence first, but you don't know what the story is. Can you describe a bit more about how you go about that and whether newsrooms have the necessary skills to be able to get through the amount of data that is now available and finding the story at the bottom of it?
Claire, do you want to start with that?
I think most newspapers these days do have data teams, or at least a couple of people who are very familiar with that way of working. Though in an investigative team specifically, you might have one or two people who are particularly good at that. So at the Telegraph, we've got data journalists, and a couple of people in my team are very proficient as well. It's a really interesting point about when you start looking, you're crunching all this data to try to find the story, and that can be incredibly long-winded. So I was talking to a colleague the other day about a big kind of data drop, and the time it takes to go through to find out, well, is there anything here? And you almost need to examine an awful lot of pieces of paper or numbers or whatever before you know the answer. So it's kind of upside down. But to answer your question, I do think most newspapers do have the relevant skills, but that's also why you want to be bringing new people in who might be better than yourself. And to run a good team, you've got to know where, what things you're not so good at, so that you can draft someone in who's a specialist.
Do they have a similar team of people at BuzzFeed to go through data drops?
Yeah, we specifically have a data investigations team who are kind of embedded in our wider team, and they are absolute geniuses, and I can use an Excel spreadsheet, but nothing to do with the magic that they can work. And there was an interesting example on my colleague Heidi's big story when she first landed at BuzzFeed about tennis match fixing. And I think that most of the time with data journalism, you kind of speak to a source who gives you a lead on something, and then you kind of look into the data to see if that stacks up. But in this case, one of our data journalists in the US, he had basically managed to get hold of all these data, this massive kind of trove of data which he'd scraped from open sources, which kind of showed the results of matches, and there was kind of a suspicious pattern of like certain players losing when they weren't supposed to, but it wasn't enough to be like, this is what's going on. So then Heidi came in, and with all kind of her FIFA and sporting contacts, then spoke to the people, got hold of the leaked tennis match fixing report, and then you could kind of show the meaning of that data. So I think it can work both ways, but you need someone who really understands the data, like Claire said, to be able to look through for that.
Brilliant. I think we've got enough time for a maximum of 2 more questions. Got someone right at the back, just over there. If you could stand so we can see you.
Yeah. I'm Sammy from News Associates. I guess my question is, we are in this time where the news circle is extremely fast. You've got digital there. There are so many elements of the business that require resources. How hard is it for you, the investigative journalism team, to actually say, fight for your slice of the pie as per se, because you have longer lead times in which you produce the results?
Does anyone want to, in particular, Jonathan?
Well, I mean, it's kind of, we are slow journalism, really. I mean, we're kind of, the thing about investigative journalism is that we're really only reporters, but we just have more time. And so we just take an awful long time. And in terms of and if a newspaper or a website or whatever it would be, is going to commit all that amount of money it takes to have 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5 people working on a single story for 2 or 3 months, there is usually a willingness in the newspaper to kind of give it a good display in the newspaper or whatever the medium is, and so we find actually increasingly that in the kind of the era in which people are worried about whether what they're reading is true on the internet, that this kind of long-form journalism is regarded very, very well by our readers, and it's it's one of those things that kind of marks us out as an organisation that takes our responsibility to do public interest journalism properly. And so we don't. I've been quite encouraged, actually. I mean, I think you know, all the kind of the changes that have happened in the media have actually worked for the better for investigative journalism. And over the last few years, there have been far more investigative teams being set up, certainly within newspapers, whereas there used to be ad hoc teams, they're now very permanent teams. And so there's a lot of money going into it, and I think there's a lot of willingness behind it.
Excellent. Got time for one more? Have you got any more questions? Somebody right over the back just there. Make it a good one, you're the last one.
No pressure.
Hi, I'm Anushri. I'm a student at UCL. And I was wondering, I had a question along the same lines in terms of resources. So a lot of what news has to do is with timeliness, but investigative journalism is different in that you need to dig deep into the story. So if you find something, if you come across something that happened 3 years ago, and if you need the kind of media, a significant amount of media coverage to even be able to delve into the story and get access to the documents that might help you investigate it further. How do you go around doing that? Because it's kind of a loop where you need the data to break the story, but then you need to break the story to have the data.
Right, okay. Tom, is that one you want to...
So do you mean sort of how do you create that time in order to...
I meant like if something has happened 3 years ago and you need to do an investigation of it now because it has been recently brought to your attention or it has recently been repeated, but then to access the data or to access the resources of what happened around then or what was involved, you need the kind of coverage to be able to go through bureaucracy or administration or government apathy. You need a certain amount of pressure on the government from journalists to be able to access that. Does that make sense? I'm sorry. Should I rephrase it?
I'm a bit confused. So do you mean in terms of tipping someone off about the story in order so you can get the details that you need to make the story? So,
not just tipping someone off, but then a lot of what news has to do is with timeliness, right? Something happens today, so people would not be reading about it 10 days from now, but tomorrow it makes no sense covering it at a later period of time.
Yeah.
But then a lot of what investigative journalism has to do is with going in depth about stories that might not have been uncovered when they actually happened.
No, I think it's about the difficulty of historically going back to a story and being
I guess you kind of create the new newsline yourself, don't you, by uncovering it. So, you know, even if the information's really old, which is often the case of, say, you know, historic abuse investigations or whatever it is, the uncovering of it is the story in itself, and getting people to say things about it for the first time gives you that fresh new line.
The thing about it, I think what you're trying to get over is because it's happened some time ago, it's more difficult to unearth the information that you need.
Yeah, I'm sorry, what I meant was...
There is one point there that if there's been an attempt to suppress, it's given them longer for the cover-up. But then the cover-up often becomes the bigger story. It might be more difficult, but you can usually manage somehow to get that story, even if it is 3 years old. Jonathan,
you can play that to your advantage somewhat a little bit. So 3 years ago, I would say, is nothing. If it were 25 years ago, I think, yeah, that's quite hard. But you can actually, you'd think, well, who knows? And I always ask myself that question, well, who knows the answers that I'm looking for? You almost plot it out, and you might have a list of 5, 10 people. You go and knock on their doors and say, I think this happened 3 years ago. Do you know anything about it? It all seemed a bit weird to me. And somehow that kind of time means they might be more likely to talk to you than if it happened last week. So it could actually be a positive rather than negative.
And especially if you're dealing with victims of trauma, you know, abuse, something like that, it's much easier to talk to them or get them to speak out if a bit of time has passed and they've processed what's happened.
Yeah, I guess my main question was like, how do you combat the compassion fatigue because it has been overwritten or it hasn't been touched?
I think between all of them. I think they sort of answered your question, but thank you so much for that. But that signals the end of our session. Thank you so much to all of our panellists, and thank you for being a great audience. Thanks to everyone that asked questions. I believe it's your lunchtime now, and I have to say that it's sponsored by BBC News, so enjoy. Thank you.